temporary ceasefire between Israel and Palestine, Hamas. But this has to be much more. This opportunity, this brief window, this brief reprieve from the horrific slaughter that we've witnessed over the last month has to be extended not merely to a permanent ceasefire, but to a plan for peace as called for by Schiller Institute founder Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Now, some things have been going on that I would just like to let people know about. One, very interesting, there was a press conference today held by the president of Egypt, El-Sisi, together with the prime ministers of Spain and Belgium. And he said, quote, "There is a need for a different approach, one that involves the international community's recognition of a Palestinian state and its entry into the United Nations." In case you don't know, Palestine, the PLO has an observer status. They're not a recognized member of the United Nations because so far they do not have statehood. They have not been a recognized state. He said the only solution to the Palestinian issue is the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel within the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, unquote. President El-Sisi also said he would be ready to accept a demilitarized Palestinian state, potentially even with the presence of international forces, whether from NATO, the UN, or American or Arab forces, to guarantee the security of both the Palestinian and Israeli states. Now, interestingly, the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, concurred with President El-Sisi on the issue of a permanent ceasefire and the importance of reaching a two-state solution. The Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander De Croo, also expressed agreement, adding a demand that Israel must open more border crossings for the entry of humanitarian aid. I will say one of the huge issues right now in Gaza is water. You don't have fuel for desalination. You don't have clean water. You don't have clean drinking water, and that means disease. So this is one of the urgent matters that should be addressed. But as I said, this cannot be merely 4 days. I know Bibi Netanyahu says, oh, yes, and we're going to resume hostilities immediately. We're going to start shelling. No, the world has to ensure that that does not occur. Now, the topic this evening is really the United States, which has to come to play a role for the good. In the worst case, if we don't, we might succeed in annihilating the entire planet through thermonuclear war or some other insane blunder. Or maybe we won't annihilate the planet, but we ourselves will become a totally bankrupt, degenerate husk of a leftover nation and irrelevant. I don't consider either one of those options acceptable. Our nation has to return to the principles under which we are founded. The president of Indonesia, Sukarno, at the first Bandung Conference, referred to the United States as the first successful anti-colonial revolution. People don't know this anymore. People think that the United States was simply founded by a bunch of slave-owning racists who exterminated the Native American populations. And frankly, why did we need a revolution then? We would have been a happy outpost of the British Empire with British colonial methods. What Lyndon LaRouche understood very clearly was that our nation was founded as a bulwark against this kind of oppression. Remember, who were the pilgrims? Why did they come here? They didn't come here as lords and ladies and wanting to dominate other people. They came here because of religious persecution and because, as great thinkers in Europe and leaders like Joan of Arc, Nicholas of Cusa, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, that they could not establish a form of government based on universal principles, based on self-government, because Europe was locked up in a kind of a caste system of duchesses and barons and kings and queens, and you were stuck doing whatever your father did. So people came here to defend universal principles. And I wanted to just remind people about the actual first Thanksgiving after the Mayflower had landed. And I will say, as I think about a third of Americans are descended from someone on the Mayflower, although everyone may not know that. My grandmother made a point of digging it out, so I know that my ancestor was Peregrine White, who was born on the ship. And I think about it sometimes. What would it have been like to come here and live through the first winter or die? Because apparently out of over 100 pilgrims, only 44 lived through the first winter. It was extremely difficult. And there were a couple of groups of Native Americans, namely the Wampanoag tribe, which actually helped these settlers and grew a lot of food and helped to avert starvation. So the actual first Thanksgiving in 1621 was a great feast among the pilgrims and at least 90 members of that Native American tribe. In other words, it wasn't natural or preordained or the intent to slaughter the Native American population. Had you not had the British and other people with an oligarchical outlook, people susceptible to that, perhaps we would have much more effectively coexisted. Perhaps there were also cultural problems among some of the Native American tribes that made it impossible to cooperate. I will say there were explicit people who had genocidal intentions, like the treasonous President Andrew Jackson, who not only shut down the Second National Bank, but drove the Cherokee Nation to extinction virtually with his famous or infamous Trail of Tears. But that wasn't true to the principles of the founding of our republic. So I think this is really urgent. I think that people would do well to look up the writings of people like Cotton and Increase Mather, to read the Mayflower Compact, because the intention of this nation, and when we finally got years later, 150 or so years later, to the Declaration of Independence, our nation was founded on universal principles, not American principles. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That's not American. That is universal. That's what it means to be human. And our nation was supposed to be upholding that principle for the entire human race, not by running off and invading countries and overthrowing their leaders, but by demonstrating through example that human beings were capable of and worthy of self-government. And yes, we had brawls. We didn't, the United States people should see as a work in progress. It took us a century to get rid of slavery, nearly. And that's not because many of the founding fathers like Ben Franklin, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris, Alexander Hamilton didn't vehemently oppose slavery. There were fights, there were brawls. That's why Frederick Douglass, in his very long speech, which people should read to the end, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, came to the conclusion that the Constitution of the United States was not a pro-slavery document. And I think if our nation is going to be any good, we have to go back and reflect on the intent of our nation, which was a revolutionary, anti-colonial power for the good of mankind. And therefore, we should begin reflecting that both internally. Right now, we have a whole group of people who are supposed to be invisible, the people who are mentally ill, incarcerated, suffering from homelessness. No one's supposed to think about that. That's part of the United States. These people have the same rights as everyone else. Our government is supposed to be defending that and promoting the general welfare. And we have to have a foreign policy that reflects an equal commitment to those policies. So I will be joined by two of my younger volunteers. I just did want to start by sharing briefly George Washington's Thanksgiving proclamation. This was the first time as the United States. He had been inaugurated at Federal Hall in Manhattan, unfortunately, where Wall Street now sits. And this is his Thanksgiving proclamation. I will not read the whole thing, just an excerpt from October 3rd of 1789. And then we will hear from both Simon Miller and Robert Castle of some proclamations and thoughts on future presidents. So Washington says, whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits and humbly implore his protection and favor, that he said he's been requested to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity to peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. Safety and happiness. And he says that we may then, on the 26th day of November, all unite in rendering unto him, the Creator, our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and protection of the people of this country previous to their becoming a nation, for the signal and manifold mercies and the favorable interpositions of his providence, which we experienced in the course and conclusion of the late war, the American Revolution, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty, which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one, the new Constitution, now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have acquired and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general for all the great and various favors which he hath been pleased to confer upon us. I think this is very significant. It indicates a certain degree of humility. I don't know that the King of England or others ever declared such a day until perhaps after the United States. And it signifies a recognition that there are principles greater than ourselves that we have to consider, that everything didn't occur because we are complete, perfected geniuses, as certain leaders of the US and particularly the UK, like Tony Blair, still believe. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn it over to Simon Miller to tell us about a later Thanksgiving proclamation. Simon, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Diane. I really appreciate those words. And before I get directly into the speech itself, I want to give a little bit of historical context, just like you did. Exactly 83 years to the day after the speech that you just read, Diane, was the proclamation given by Abraham Lincoln that is known as the Thanksgiving Proclamation. It has the same title. It's on the same day, 83 years later. And it directly references the Washington speech at a couple different parts. And I also want to say that as far as the short-term political context of it, it was just a matter of weeks after the conclusion of the Battle of Gettysburg, which is considered one of the major turning points of the Civil War or the Second American Revolution. And it was just, I believe, 1 month, almost exactly to the day, maybe a couple days off, before the Gettysburg Address, which is one of the most prolific and famous speeches in all of US history from any president. So with that context in mind, I'm going to share my screen because myself and Robert have made some slides here. So I'm going to share it now, and hopefully you guys can see it. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Then I will begin. Abraham Lincoln, 1863. The year that is drawing towards its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added, which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart which is habitually insensible to the ever watchful providence of Almighty God. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and to provoke their aggression, peace has been preserved with all nations. Order has been maintained. The laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere, except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. Needful diversions of wealth and of strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines, as well of iron and coal as of the precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy. It has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged, as with one heart and one voice by the whole American people. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. And I recommend to them that while offering up the ascriptions justly due to him for such singular deliverances and blessings, they do also, with humble penitence for our national perverseness and disobedience, commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife in which we are unavoidably engaged, and fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore it as soon as may be consistent with the divine purposes to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and the Union. In testimony whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed, done at the city of Washington, this 3rd day of October, in the year of our Lord 1863, and of the independence of the United States, the 88th. That is all. And now I will pass it off to Robert. And I can either stop sharing the screen to show his face, or I can leave it on the slideshow.
How about we get to see his face for a moment, and then you can share screen again.
1 second.
Nice. So yeah, I hadn't heard that that Lincoln Thanksgiving address until Diane sent it to me recently, and this sort of historical narrative that Diane is tracing out tonight with the Washington address and the Lincoln address, and what I'll read with Kennedy's words that were spoken just almost exactly 100 years after Lincoln's is, I think, especially appropriate for the current moment, because we were just at a rally this morning in solidarity with the people who are suffering and being killed in Gaza at Washington Square Park. And there was people speaking rightly about the fact that they were protesting politically and demonstrating instead of shopping on this holiday, Black Friday. And they also commented on the traditions of Thanksgiving, which many of them saw as fraudulent with regard to specifically the plight of indigenous people who had been who had their land seized in various forms throughout the course of the expansion of the United States. And Diane did address some of that in the opening, and I think, of course, that's just something that is always going to remain something a point of reflection politically and otherwise for anyone living in the United States. But it specifically the thing that, and I'll get to this JFK thing quickly, but the thing that struck me about all of these addresses that I hadn't read before was that this day of Thanksgiving is largely about a certain sort of national penitence for a kind of inclination to sinfulness, or almost a sort of national perversity. And the sense that I have is that if the people at the demonstration this morning knew what Lincoln and Washington really conceived this Thanksgiving holiday to be, they wouldn't necessarily see their view as being separate. In other words, I think we are actually, along the lines of what Diane was saying, quite close to a sort of revolutionary patriotism, but it's about sort of finding a way to make it cogent, make it coherent, to sort of untangle the knot of British imperialism from the identity of the American citizen. And I think JFK's assassination and his life are really at the heart of that whole conundrum that we're now facing today. So maybe I can move on now to reading his address 100 years after what Simon read. And I think it bears noting, as far as I understand, Kennedy did not live to deliver this.
Correct. And let me just say, it wasn't delivered. I think Johnson presented another proclamation, which I think is really quite a tragedy, but we can deliver it now. It was written before he was assassinated, which was 6 days before the Thanksgiving date, which was November 28th that year.
Right. Okay. Okay. So this is the proclamation by the President of the United States of America. Over 3 centuries ago, our forefathers in Virginia and in Massachusetts, far from home in a lonely wilderness, set aside a time of thanksgiving. On the appointed day, they gave reverent thanks for their safety, for the health of their children, for the fertility of their fields, and the love which bound them together, and for the faith which united them with their God. So too, when the colonies achieved their independence, our first president, in the first year of his first administration, proclaimed November 26, 1789, as a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many signal favors of Almighty God, and called upon the people of the new republic to beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions, to promote the knowledge and practice of true religion and virtue, and generally to grant unto all mankind such a degree of temporal prosperity as he alone knows to be best. And so too, in the midst of America's tragic Civil War, President Lincoln proclaimed the last Thursday of November 1863 as a day to renew our gratitude for America's fruitful fields, for our national strength and vigor, and for all our singular deliverances and blessings. Much time has passed since the first colonists came to rocky shores and dark forests of an unknown continent. Much time since President Washington led a young people into the experience of nationhood. Much time since President Lincoln saw the American nation through the ordeal of fraternal war. And in these years, our population, our plenty, and our power have all grown apace. Today, we are a nation of nearly 200 million souls, stretching from coast to coast, on into the Pacific and north toward the Arctic. A nation enjoying the fruits of an ever-expanding agriculture and industry, and achieving standards of living unknown in previous history. We give our humble thanks for this. Yet, as our power has grown, so has our peril. Today, we give our thanks most of all for the ideals of honor and faith we inherit from our forefathers, for the decency of purpose, steadfastness of resolve, and strength of will, for the courage and the humility which they possessed, and which we must seek every day to emulate. As we express our gratitude, we must never forget that the highest appreciation is not to utter words, but to live by them. Let us therefore proclaim our gratitude to Providence for manifold blessings. Let us be humbly thankful for inherited ideals, and let us resolve to share those blessings and those ideals with our fellow human beings throughout the world. Now, therefore, I, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America, in consonance with the joint resolution of the Congress approved December 26, 1941, designating the fourth Thursday of November in each year as Thanksgiving Day, do hereby proclaim Thursday, November 28, 1963, as a day of national Thanksgiving. On that day, let us gather in sanctuaries dedicated to worship and in homes blessed by family affection to express our gratitude for the glorious gifts of God. And let us earnestly and humbly pray that He will continue to guide and sustain us in the great unfinished tasks of achieving peace, justice, and understanding among all men and nations, and of ending misery and suffering wherever they exist. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States of America to be affixed.
Thank you. So one obvious point to be made is that both of those presidents were assassinated. They were both assassinated by the British Empire, by forces related to that. In the case of Lincoln, this I found really horrific to imagine. There's a recounting of it in one of the books by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I think it's called The Crossing of the Armies, where he talks about this very difficult campaign through the wilderness, the Five Forks, etc. And then the surrender at Appomattox, where he was selected by President Lincoln to receive the surrender, probably because Lincoln knew that he would grant the surrendering Confederate soldiers the degree of dignity and respect that would help plant the seeds for the nation to be reunified. And he did, to much controversy. Then he describes the march back to Washington, and you can imagine going back through battlefields where you had not had time to bury the dead, and taking the time to bury the dead, find the mementos, the names, the messages that you had to bring back and deliver to their loved ones. what an extremely difficult march going back to Washington, D.C., where there was scheduled to be a victory parade of the Union, of the Republic. And he describes a day, it was a torrential downpour. A messenger arrives and they receive word that President Lincoln has been assassinated. So they get the word of the assassination of President Lincoln before they're even back in Washington, D.C., or a victory procession at which the president who guided the nation to victory against the Confederacy is no longer living. And I think it's a testament to the power of the culture of that time and the identity, and perhaps Abraham Lincoln's great love of Shakespeare, indicative of a certain cultural standard, that the nation did not totally disintegrate, that you had President Grant, you had then two more assassinated presidents, Garfield and McKinley, but we had leadership that continued to develop the perfection of our union, I would say. And then we had really difficult times. Woodrow Wilson, horrible case. Teddy Roosevelt, terrible. It was an embattled situation. Then we had Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had a personal connection to Alexander Hamilton, a deep hatred of the British, a personal commitment to the idea that there should be free and independent republics all over the world, including the nations of Africa, Southwest Asia, Ibero-America. And after FDR, what did we have but J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI takeover, the witch hunts. Eisenhower was a bit of a reprieve. And then we had Kennedy. And then we had 4 assassinations. And our nation has never recovered. And some of us were lucky enough to work closely with Lyndon LaRouche, who was a real American genius who ran for president. But as a result of the coup which had occurred, not just with the assassination of President Kennedy, but the Warren Commission cover-up, and the fact they were able to make the Warren Commission cover-up stick, even though everyone knew it couldn't be true. In a sense, that was a surrender to saying that the people who ran those assassinations would then be running the country. So instead of getting out of the Vietnam War, we continued the Vietnam War to great horror. And then we had 9/11, another incident, another coup d'etat for which we never got the answer to it. And we plunged into war upon war upon war, killing over 1 million people in Iraq, displacing tens of millions of people. And here we are today. And I think it would be one of the great ironies of history if it is the courageous children of Gaza who cause the American people, who reach our conscience, who invoke the better angels of our nation, as Lincoln said, to remind our nation to come back to its senses and to not be barbaric. So those are my thoughts, but I would like to hear from both of you as well.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of different ways to take that, but I do think this very last point that you made about the irony or the sort of this reversal where it does seem that this great upheaval that's happening in the United States and all around the world is all emanating out of really you could say, I mean, like the power of one innocent soul, one child's innocent soul in Gaza, in the sense that it's sort of microcosm of a people besieged by what is essentially a kind of international power structure that is completely run amok. It does seem to me that that sort of irony, or that that paradox or whatever it is, of the power of the powerless to ignite moral consciousness does seem to me the sort of defining characteristic of what's happening in the world today. And it does seem to me that the moral test of people in America in particular is whether or not they can find a way to articulate, to have that be a genuinely moral consciousness that is awoken in them. And it's very interesting because we've been going to a lot of different demonstrations, and you hear this sort of legitimate articulation that when people are utterly oppressed, that resistance is justified. And it would be pretty hard to argue against that in the case of Gaza in particular, when you have people that are literally born into a sort of concentration camp type situation where they have literally no prospects for their lives, and they understand that they're essentially militarily surveilled, and that their entire family is sort of under the thumb of a military dictatorship that has no concern for their well-being. That nevertheless, it does seem to me that the real challenge for Americans is to, in spite of that, and maybe this is the irony, that is that it actually does have to be, from my perspective, a peace, a consciousness of the necessity of peace. And it does seem like that's when you think about the assassinations in particular. To me, it seems that, without getting into a kind of religious concept of martyrdom, just the basic idea that when you see time and time again throughout history that when certain forces try to kill the moral center of the development of historical consciousness towards a sort of republican ideal of the kinds that are enshrined in our Constitution, it never actually succeeds in destroying the good. In other words, the truth actually is more powerful than any kind of evil that might be directed to try to stop it. And yet there is this sort of contention that's happening historically. So there's a brief passage at the end of the introduction to this book, JFK and the Unspeakable, which this book certainly forced a kind of moral recognition in my mind. And the author says that the belief behind this book, which is an exhaustive sort of historical compendium of the record surrounding JFK's assassination, he says the belief behind this book is that truth is the most powerful force on earth, what Gandhi called satyagraha, truth force or soul force. By his experiments in truth, Gandhi turned theology on its head, saying truth is God. Truth is God. We all see a part of the truth and can seek it more deeply. Its other side is compassion, our response to suffering. So it's in that light that I do think that we do have the opportunity to really to accomplish a kind of a patriotic American moral revolution, but it does require getting a broad section of the public to understand a kind of a principled account of history in a situation where to even bring up certain historical events gets you labeled as insane. So it's very interesting, I guess. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, there's certainly more that could be said, but
what I would like to say, building on what Robert said and what you said, Diane, is that, like, yeah, I mean, the truth is God, and the truth is that there is a lost and actively, not even lost, but actively covered up teleological history of the Republic that the United States is a living embodiment of, right? And from the Declaration of Independence and the first principles enshrined in that were sort of gone over by you, Diane, in the opening of tonight's event, to the successful American Revolution, to the establishment of that actual physical manifestation of those first principles devised in the Declaration of Independence, to fighting off, war after war imposed by British colonialism, the War of 1812, this imposed confederacy sponsored by the British, where we had to continually reinforce and re-harden and strengthen our faith in particular first principles. And that's what I find so moving about all three of these speeches, is that is part of the center point, is to say we might be facing struggle, we might be facing internal war, we might be facing war from the outside, from the British, we might be facing whatever it may be, whatever challenge it might be, but there is a through line of Republican values that need to be strengthened and remembered, and that we must have faith in if we are going to see truth as God, and we are going to fight off those challenges and bring about a continued manifestation of the first principles upon which this nation was founded. And of course, that teleology goes way further back than the founding of the United States. So we are living history in that sense. We are carrying forward a torch that is thousands of years old. And at this point, we're standing on the precipice of essentially two paths, where we either let that flame die out and we give up on the American Republican project, we give up on the people of America, we give up on the people of the world, as was stated by the fact that these are universal principles, they're not American principles. Or we stand up and we say, no, we're not going to let a rogue faction of colonialism that has taken over and corrupted everything that we knew as the American project for the last several decades. We're not going to let you drive us off a cliff. We're not going to let you kill everybody on the planet. We're certainly not going to let you flagrantly deny those very first principles that are to us truth, that are to us God. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks. Well, I just wanted to add that what we see in the streets, and I must say, I would like to congratulate those people who glued themselves to Fifth Avenue and diverted the path of the Macy's Day Parade. And then one of the comments, which was, how dare you, you really don't understand the tradition. No, of course they understand the tradition. Thanksgiving is a time, as you were saying, for humility and to give thanks and to recognize that perhaps we need forgiveness for our transgressions, and that we have received abundance which we did not deserve, perhaps. It's that kind of time of reflection, and therefore very appropriate to remember. And I think it is a time when many Americans do remember those who are less fortunate than we may be. But how do we act? But going on, it is also, I've had in mind a question of what it would take when the photographs came out from Iraq, Abu Ghraib, the torture that the US was doing. And I was so horrified, and I thought, well, of course, the American people are going to rebel against this. We're going to have people in the streets. This is going to end. But it wasn't. It was actually like a re-election stunt or something for Bush, right? It was like Caligula. I think it was Caligula who said, let them hate me, but let them fear me. And we had people running around trying to justify waterboarding when any person with common sense, I mean, ask yourself, if someone was pulling out your fingernails as that despicable Obama character, whatever his name was threatening the poor halal cart owner with, wouldn't most people just say whatever it took to get the person to stop torturing them? So just common sense tells you that torture doesn't give you good intelligence, But more important than that, it's against natural law. You are trying to subvert what has been given by God uniquely to man, which is free will. You're trying to force a person through violence to do something as opposed to recognizing reason. So anyone who perpetrates torture on someone is committing a crime against natural law. We had people running around defending it. Crazy. It was horrible. And then this latest battle with Ukraine, I kept saying, is there no bottom line, right? Biden says we're not going to send tanks. Then we send tanks. Then the next thing you know, he says, well, we're out of munitions, so we're going to send cluster bombs. We considered cluster bombs a war crime. There are children in Laos who are still dying today, 500 a year, dying because of cluster bombs we dropped there in the late 60s and 70s. Now we are sending cluster bombs to Ukraine, and then depleted uranium, which caused horrific increases in cancer rates in Iraq. And you start to wonder, are we so depraved that everyone is just simply prepared to go along with anything? Are we just going to go off the cliff into oblivion? And thankfully, you see, at least in the case of the slaughter of children, of premature babies in incubators, ironically, exactly what we accused the Iraqis of doing in Kuwait, which they were not doing, which turned out to be a total fraud, is what the IDF was doing to Palestinian babies at Al-Shifa Hospital, in effect, by raiding the hospital, bombing hospitals, forcing people to take infants. And it seems that somehow we have now come to the point where people are saying, no, this is enough. This is enough. And the floodgates could open. And you see it in the United States, the kind of revolt where even though Hollywood fires every actor who stands up against genocide, you see hundreds of congressional staffers coming out on the street saying, our bosses are wrong. We're demanding a change. We see a shift now in the Congress with a growing number calling for a ceasefire, including 3 Jewish representatives of Congress. So this is very important. This is the kernel of a mass strike, and we see it. I don't know, there were probably 2,500 people out there today at Washington Square Park where we were, and you see that people have moved. We're moving. Now the question is the Schiller question. Has a great moment found a little people, or has a great moment found a good people, a generous people, a people capable of thinking 50 years from now? Many people today said, we don't just want a 4-day ceasefire, we want a permanent ceasefire. We don't just want a permanent ceasefire, and we don't just want peace. We want a perspective that 50 years from now, there could be 12 billion people living on the planet with a higher standard of living, longer life expectancy, fluent in more languages, prolific on more musical instruments and classical drama than any of the people currently alive today. And that we should, by that time, begin building cities on Mars, figuring out how to get to other parts of the universe. In other words, we have to have a vision of where we are going. You can think of a person, if you step out on the sidewalk, do you just just kind of arbitrarily stroll from one side to the other and decide maybe you're going to sit down and roll down the sidewalk because it's interesting? Or no, the reason why you get somewhere is you have an idea in your mind before you're going there of where you're going. How can mankind hope to be successful if we have no vision of where we're supposed to be 50 and 100 years from now? And what is that vision based on? And I think this is now you come to the domain of Helga's 10 principles, and the most important, the 10th, mankind is inherently good and mankind is perfectible. That is, we will never be perfect, but we are capable of becoming less and less imperfect, which is a very happy thing to do. So those are my thoughts. We should wrap up shortly. Perhaps each of you has some things that you would like to share in closing.
Well, I mean, in response to what you were saying specifically about the depravity of our culture and the lengths to which our immorality seem to have been stretched with regard to child sacrifice essentially being the final kind of potential saving grace for our conscience, being that we might actually be capable of saying no to child sacrifice as a civilization. It is very interesting because that is almost archetypally archaic, right? And I think of the binding of Isaac and um, this story, this thousands of year old story of of a of a representative member of the tribe of Israel who was tested by God specifically with regard to his willingness to kill his own child to gain God's graces or to prove his faith to God. And of course, God intervenes in the final moment to tell him that, of course, it's not the will of the creator that he actually kill his child or kill a child. And I do think that that is essentially what's happening right now. And it's very interesting because what you were saying about the need for a vision of the future, I think that there's an interesting kind of mutuality where it is, I think this lack of a vision for the future that you're describing is also what leaves a situation where you have a sort of a lack of imagination with regard to what the past actually is, what the past actually represents. That you could have a people who define themselves by traditions which contain something like the story of the binding of Isaac, justifying the sacrifice of children as 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 evidence of their divine favor. So it seems like that it's not just the future that is, you don't just deprive yourself of a real future when you have a lack of actual purpose, but you actually deprive yourself of the past as well when you don't have when you fail to articulate an actual purpose for your own life in the present. And so that I think it really is all time that we are trying to sort of redeem as a civilization right now. It's very interesting that we need history and we need the future and we need it in the present. And there's a sense of pregnancy, and it's very interesting at these demonstrations to have the sense that something is very close, but that it's not guaranteed. And I certainly hope that everyone listens to the better angels of their nature in the coming months and in years.
What I want to say in closing is just that, like, when you were talking about this better vision for the future, as Robert has now expanded on to a great deal of this all time, what immediately came to mind was that myself and some of my friends, we drove down to Leesburg, Virginia for the memorial of Marcia Freeman. Marcia Freeman, this amazing, wonderful mind who I never personally got to meet, so sadly, who was a space scientist, a nuclear fusion researcher, and a longtime collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche movement in general. And she wrote so many books, particularly pertaining to Craft Erica and his positive vision for the future of humanity as this spacefaring society and lunar colonies and a Mars colony and all of these things. And so I unfortunately I haven't had the time recently due to the rapid motion of the situation at hand here in the United States to sit down and like read one of her books. But after having learned about her and talked with all of these people who did know her and got very familiar with her intense optimism for the future of humanity on that basis, I'm just super excited to read some of her works, and I would recommend that anybody who's listening to this to look into Marsha Freeman, look into what she did, and look into that positive vision of humanity that she outlines in her books. Look into Craft Erica, look into all of these things, because there is an alternative to the madness. It exists. It is the LaRouche movement. It is Diane Sayers' Senate campaign. It is these things. This is the struggle for a positive, optimistic future based on the values enshrined in our Declaration of Independence.
Thank you. So just, I'd like to say a few things, the story of Abraham and Isaac. And the angel came down and said, don't, there's a ram, I think, for the sacrifice. Along just in terms of the region, the history, one very important voice for peace, which people in the United States wouldn't know, my idiot warmongering Congressman Michael Lawler doesn't seem to know that the families of the hostages, the Israeli families of the hostages taken by Hamas, have been very vocal, by and large, the majority of them. I can't say if it's every single one, but the majority and the most vocal against the genocide. I saw an interview done with one of them by all despicable news organs, the Wall Street Journal, where she said, you can't imagine the pain of losing your son. This is not a hostage. This is, her son was actually killed October 7th. She said, this pain is so unique and so unbearable. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, and I don't want anyone else to suffer it. And that is really what Schiller, in a sense, would call the sublime, where this suffering, this hardship becomes a strength which you endure in order to supersede it with a greater good. And this also is the case. Netanyahu had enormous opposition in Israel prior to October 7th and certainly following, which is not being covered here. Here we see people saying insane things like no ceasefire. What person in their right mind would say no ceasefire? By implication, that means that you want more people to be killed. Who would want that? Only someone as juvenile as Congressman Mike Lawler, among others who run around saying things like that. It is possible for human beings to figure out a way to live together in harmony with different religions, different ethnic backgrounds, different political structures. There are still certain universal principles toward which we can strive together. And that is really the fight of this campaign, my campaign, to somehow rescue the principle of the presidency of the United States and to get our nation to move on the right side of history. The last thing I'll just say is that this Sunday at 11 a.m., the Schiller Institute is hosting a viewing of a movie called 815. It was made by a Japanese American daughter of a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing. And the showing of the film will be preceded by a talk from Ray McGovern and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. You can go to schillerinstitute.com to register, to get information, to get the link so that you can watch this. Donations are welcome to defray the cost of the viewing. $5 more or less per person would be a great help. But I would encourage people to watch it. It's not merely about the horror of Hiroshima, which is something people should bear in mind if you're going to be flippant about the danger of nuclear war, but it's also about the question of forgiveness, which is going to be something many, many of us are going to have to come to terms with, given the horrific crimes that are being committed by, among others, the Biden administration, etc. And by forgiveness, I don't mean to say that people who commit hideous crimes should be allowed to continue them, but people like Joe Biden and that ridiculous man, that vicious, nasty man from the Obama administration, should be put somewhere safe where they can't harm other people. And I think we should dedicate ourselves to making sure that that happens, that people who are dangerous and evil are put out of harm's way. Maybe they can learn to play the violin or something, and that will change their heart. So thanks, everyone, for listening. With any luck, we will be together again next Friday. If you want to volunteer for my campaign or donate, please visit SARE, S-A-R-E, for Senate.com. Good night.
That was sudden.
Oh, she left?
Yeah.
Okay.
Her and that's crazy. Her and whoever was running the ICLC one literally left at the exact same time.